The wait is over. 11.0 of FreeBSD has officially launched. We're going to have coverage of this, plus a couple looks back at UNIX history, and our favorite crowd guest is going to be on today. Stick around for your place to be, SD. BSD Now, episode 163, The Return of the Cantrill, recorded October 12th, 2016. Hey, I'm your host, Chris Moore.
And I'm Alan Jude.
Glad to have you all with us this week. We have a good, exciting episode, as you probably heard from the title. Yes, Brian Cantrill is going to be with us a little later, so you got to stick around for that. So buckle up. It's going to be a very full episode. Yes. I can promise you that. But we have a lot of news to get to, including the new FreeBSD 11.0 release now is officially out. It's officially dropped, so if you had seen the earlier images on the FTP server, like, no, you have a new one now. That's the real deal. But tell us a little bit why that happened, Alan. What was the
holdup
so there?
As we mentioned the other week, a last-minute reroll to pick up OpenSSL updates, and then the updates to those OpenSSL updates, and bundle a bunch of other security fixes in with that. Meant the release ended up a little behind schedule. It was, I think, supposed to be October 5th, and it came out on the 9th. But you can now download FreeBSD 11. It will actually be 11.0 release-P1 to include the patches. That was mostly so that anyone who did download the old one will be able to update to this and have it correct. So that's good. And the release is better for all that extra effort from the release engineering team. But some highlights of the release are improved 802.11n support and various Wi-Fi drivers, including IWM, so that your Wi-Fi on your modern Intel laptops will work. Support for ARM64 has been added and is pretty much tier 1, which is a big deal for anybody that wants to do something like that, especially the Cavium server-style ARM64s.
That's nice.
Beehive has native graphics support, so you can actually run Windows installer and do it without having to do all headless. That was a big deal. For quality of life things, the flag in etc/tty's on if console has been set. So if you actually boot up and your dev ptyU0 is your console, it will automatically turn on, and if it's not, it won't. Allowing you to basically, if you enable serial console, you don't have to go and edit this other file. One of the big reasons this made a difference was obviously that when you boot Beehive in headless mode, it uses the serial console. And by default in FreeBSD 8 and 9, you would have to edit the image after you built it before you run it to actually let you, do to have a serial console. Now the file's set up so it's automatically turns on if it's the console and turns off if it's not the console, which is quite nice.
Oh, that's great.
The XZ utility for XZip now supports multi-threaded compression. If you're making a large XZip of something, this makes a huge difference. When you can use all 24 or 32 of your cores on your server instead of one. If you're going to do a ZFS send, don't pipe it through gzip, pipe it through XZip with threading, and it makes a big difference.
That's huge.
A number of kernel panics related to VNet have been fixed, so that feature's got more usable.
Speaking of which, we're turning that on finally in TrueOS now. Since it looks like it's stable enough, you can actually use PF with it. We're going to try and confirm that this next week.
The image activation config option for the kernel has been enabled by default, which means you can use the binmiss control to make certain binaries run through QEMU userland. So this is what's required to be able to use Poudriere to build packages for ARM and MIPS and so on your x86. So that's really helpful. That's actually in a release now. You don't have to run head anymore to actually be able to compile, cross-compile packages at high speed. The generic kernel also includes IPsec by default now, and the resource control stuff is also compiled in by default, but it's disabled by a sysctl. So it's not actually running by default, but it's compiled. And if you want to use it, you just flip the kernel or the sysctl and it works. You don't have to recompile your kernel.
That's easy
I'd like
enough.
to see more and more of that as we get a towards this never having to recompile your kernel for features kind of thing.
Yeah, it'd be nice just to have one kernel to rule them all and just not ever have to change settings. Like Alt Q, can we just get that? We turn that on by default in TrueOS. Like some
I just
people
use
need that.
DummyNet, so I don't need it. But yeah.
Well, but other people need Alt Q for PF. You know?
That seems like one that could be on by default. Another interesting one, you can now configure kern.os release and kern.os rel date for jails. So before you could install FreeBSD 9 in a jail running on your FreeBSD 11 machine, but when you ran uname in the jail, it would show up as an 11 kernel. If you ran uname minus capital U, you would see you have a 9.3 user land, but it would uname would report the wrong kernel. Now you can override those in the jail so that it will actually report that it's FreeBSD 9.3, and that can be a big deal.
Is any of that automatic, or do you have to override it?
It's not automatic. You have to tell it that this jail is going to be 9.3, and then it will lie to the applications.
So you can use it to lie in other ways to the jail too. Like you think you're this.
Yeah. So you can actually make it think it's newer, but that probably won't work. But you can definitely make it think it's older.
Yeah. Okay.
I know, some people still have FreeBSD 4.11 jails running binaries they don't have the source to recompile, and that this will probably make that work a little better.
Nice.
Also, huge one for me, the minimum and maximum size of the ZFS adaptive replacement cache, or the ARC, can now be modified at runtime. So you can just be like, I need more of my memory back to run a virtual machine, so trim back the ARC. And then I'm done with that virtual machine. I would like more speed. Push the ARC back up. That makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's nice.
And of course, the chat room reminds me, yes, also the support for booting from an entirely encrypted hard drive is also there. That's some stuff I worked on. And then some things to watch out for that changed in FreeBSD 11. OpenSSH DSA key generation has been disabled by default, so if you do a fresh install of 11, there won't be DSA keys generated by your SSHD, and when you upgrade, it will stop updating that key. So make sure you have your SSH keys updated prior to upgrading, otherwise you might not be able to connect. Also, support for protocol version 1 has been removed entirely. Nobody should have been using that for 10 years now. So hopefully that one doesn't trip anybody up. By default, ifconfig will set the default regulatory domain for FCC on wireless interfaces. As a result, newly created wireless interfaces will have default settings that are less likely to violate country-specific regulations. If you're in a different region like Japan, you'll want to tell it that so that it enables the use of channel 14 or whatever it is that Japan's allowed to use.
Sure.
And then there was that caveat from last week. An issue has been discovered with Amazon EC2 images, which would cause the virtual machine to hang during boot when upgrading from FreeBSD 10.3 or earlier to 11. The new EC2, if you do a new EC2 installation, it's not affected at all, but upgrading existing ones is affected, and you're advised not to upgrade until the errata notice comes out. That errata should come out any day now. The next couple of days it'll be out, and it'll describe or it will include the fix to allow you to upgrade your EC2 images and anything else that turns out will have this problem.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. So again, beware. Just give it a little time. That errata notice will be out shortly. Be patient. Okay, so next up we have our buddy Ted Uangst has a new blog post, it looks like, talking about how consistent the output is for PS. So you wrote the notes for this one, Alan, so tell us a little bit about what he's doing here.
Yes, so this one's interesting. So Ted wondered, how consistent is the output if a process is starting and then exiting, if processes are starting and stopping constantly, and you run PS, is the output guaranteed to reflect the exact moment in time when you ran PS? Or might, PS is halfway through running and it shows the processes that were running but have since exited, or and in the bottom half maybe shows processes that have started since PS started and so are not the same. Yeah. So he wrote some tools to allow you to experiment with that. So he wrote programs chicken and egg, trying to create exactly that inconsistency. And so that you could test out your OS and see how it happens. And to prove on OpenBSD, the PS utility was switched away from reading kernel memory directly via KVM, and instead uses a sysctl kern proc all. This sysctl can iterate over the entire process list, copying out information to PS without blocking. If we prevent processes from forking or exiting during this time, we get a consistent snapshot. The snapshot will be stable and will never show us a viewpoint that didn't actually happen, which would be what you would get if it changed in the middle. So then you would assume OpenBSD will always be consistent, right? Actually, not so much.
Well, maybe not.
So he says, is there a way to trick PS on OpenBSD? Not everything is consistent. There's a separate sysctl, kern proc argv, that reads the command line arguments of a process, but it only works one process at a time. So obviously a process that changes in the middle of that could be different, right? So as PS is going through each process, checking it, one it already checked could change, and one it hasn't checked yet could change to something that it wasn't when it started reading. And so he has a second chicken and egg program that actually cycles through a list. And if you ever see the same one for two different processes, you know that it was lying. And it turns out that, yes, you can trick PS on OpenBSD and probably most other OSs. The big question becomes, so the output isn't 100% consistent. Does that matter?
Yeah, is there any real problem caused by this? Or is this just for OCD's sake?
Would it be worth the extra work to try to make it consistent? And in particular, the performance problem, if you have to take some lock where a process can't change its title or can't start and stop while someone's reading PS, that seems like you could do a denial of service by just running PS in a loop, making it impossible for any new programs to start.
Well, true, yes. Well, true, yes. Okay, so next up, we're going to take a look at some DragonFly stuff here. So as you know, of course, Wi-Fi can be one of the biggest drains on your laptop battery. So anything we can do to improve this situation should, of course, be embraced immediately. So Mir Videz over at the DragonFly project has now done some of that, porting over a new set of power management support from Linux to the IF IWM driver specifically. But just some of the notes here, it looks like add a new basic power management support via ifconfig wlan 0 power save, and then mention some of the different flags and what's happening internally. But also there's a tunable which is of interest, hardware.iwm.power scheme tunable, which will correspond to the power schemes you see in Linux IWL Wi-Fi. So of course you can set it to 1 to completely disable power management. 2 is the default. That's where you'll get balanced power management. And then of course 3 is low power mode, which will of course do some DTIM period skipping as well. So it looks like in addition to that, he does have some notes here as well that this doesn't allow you to change power management settings while you're connected. So you'll have to do this in between connecting to your access points. And you can only choose between enabled and disabled power saving with ifconfig. So if you want to switch between the balanced and low power modes, you're going to have to reboot to change the actual tunable itself ahead of time. But after changes to power management are made, of course, let's see here, you have to disconnect and reconnect to the access point for the change to take effect. But either way, this is really good stuff. And these kind of positive changes we need to see happen more often and sooner. So, of course, we can all eke out every drop of power from our respective laptops. So hopefully we'll see this land in other BSDs as well. And I'd like to see this backported to other drivers that possibly could have it as well. Okay, so next up we have dual booting OpenBSD and Linux via UEFI. So a year ago, we wouldn't even been discussing this, but today we have an article where somebody's actually doing it now. So this journey was undertaken by Brian Everly, who's working in Indiana to get an Indiana bug up and going, by the way. But he says that it was done partially due to a friend who wanted to dual boot his laptop, which already has an existing UEFI install on it. So he said he started as a proof of concept. He tried replicating his friend's setup in VMware with UEFI. So he started off by throwing Ubuntu into the VM, with some special attention paid to partitioning, of course, to ensure there's room left over for OpenBSD to be installed later on. So he mentions here in the blog post that he started by creating a 64 megabyte EFI partition at the front of the disk. So, of course, you can resize that to your particular taste. I think we create a 100 meg partition in TrueOS. I think, Alan, you said FreeBSD might do a 200 at some point? Or?
Yeah, currently it's like 800 kilobytes, but we're looking at like 200 megabytes.
800 kilobytes. Yeah, definitely need a little more than that. But yeah, that would be good. So he said next he created, of course, a 20 gigabyte primary partition at the beginning, mounted as the root file system, and then he added a 4 gig approximately swap for Ubuntu. He said finally he used the rest of the free space to create a reserved BIOS boot area or FAT32 partition that's not associated with a mount point, which of course this is where OpenBSD is going to end up living after the fact. He said with that done though, he wrapped up the Ubuntu installation, then proceeded to turn over to the OpenBSD side. Of course, some manual partitioning was required to install into the reserved FAT32 partition. And reading from the article, he says, I mashed through the defaults in the OpenBSD installer till I got to disk partitioning. Since I told VMware to make my hard drive an IDE one, I knew I was playing around with WD0 and not SD0, which is my USB key. He said I dumped into fdisk by selecting edit the partition scheme and saw my setup from Linux. First was the EFI partition. He said, I'm guessing I'm going to have to copy my boot.efi file to that at some point. He said second, of course, was the ext4 partition, and third was the swap, and then fourth was the weird-looking one that says reserve BIOS boot. So he's like, that's the one I'll fiddle with. He said issuing the command edit 3 allowed me to fiddle with partition number 3. He said, remember, you're still starting counting at 0, so pay attention. He said it's typed to A6, which is OpenBSD. Took the defaults with the exception of naming it OpenBSD. He said a quick write followed by quit, of course, allowed me to update my new partition and get back to the installer. It looks like once the installation was wrapped up, though, he said OpenBSD already helpfully created the boot EFI partition and installed the correct EFI bootloader file. He said he was able to reboot and pretty much select between the two systems at the UEFI boot screen by hitting escape and picking which one to load from. But he said for kicks, he lastly went into Ubuntu and grabbed Refind, which, of course, if you've not tried that, Refind will provide your fancy graphical selector between the two systems. So he went ahead and installed that and ended up getting a box where he can just kind of cursor over and pick between Ubuntu and OpenBSD. So he said next step's going to be replicate this process on his friend's laptop. So, of course, we wish you luck with that journey, and hopefully it goes just as smoothly. But, yeah, if you've not done this, like that's how I'm dual booting all my TrueOS boxes here. We have some laptops where I have to have Windows on it so I can do the show or other things if I'm out on the road. But Refind works really, really well. So really recommend that.
I have Refind on my T530 that I use for recording interviews on the road because it runs FreeBSD normally but can boot into Windows, and I have that set up with Refind so that I get that nice menu by default.
It's really easy to do that with the EFI too. It's like just mount the partition, you can edit a config file and tweak it to your heart's delight.
You can install Refind from BSD by just mounting that partition and copying a couple files over.
Yeah, that's exactly how we did it here, and it works pretty well. Okay, so of course, before we get to the very anticipated interview for today, we're going to have to mention our first sponsor this week, which we're going to be starting with DigitalOcean. Website for that, of course, is DigitalOcean.com, and there's no slash or anything there. Just go to DigitalOcean.com, log in, create an account, do whatever you need to do to get into your control panel. Once you've done that, though, don't forget to go to the billing section where you can add a coupon code and say FreeBSD Now is your coupon code. And that'll give you your $10 credit, which is good for running, of course, the lowest end VM for 2 months. But, $10 is $10. Maybe you want to run a little higher one for a month. And great way to give it a whirl and try it out before you commit to it. And, of course, FreeBSD support, they are on top of it. I think you said they have 11.0 already.
So a couple weeks ago, they sent an email to the mailing list saying, hey, we want to have FreeBSD 11 the day it comes out available on our thing. So we're looking for some people to help test that. And they just sent an email saying that they got lots of help with that, and they're very grateful for that. And that, yes, they, as of the release on Monday, you can now create ZFS or UFS images of FreeBSD 11 in DigitalOcean and be all ready to go. So if you want to start playing with 11, no better way than firing up, a low-cost instance of it. Remember, if you're just going to play with it, you can rent it by the hour. And at prices $0.007 an hour, 0.7 cents an hour, you can definitely play with a couple of them at once and then shut them down. If you have a little 4-hour play session and it costs you less than a nickel, it really brings up that, here's a nickel, kid, get yourself a real computer.
That's right. Well, it makes it really inexpensive to prototype things like that, right? It was like, well, okay, I got 3 or 4 hours this weekend. I'm gonna, kick around some ideas and do some work, but then I can shut it down and not be charged for the time I'm actually not doing anything on it. So that's a good deal. So again, folks, check it out at DigitalOcean.com, and of course, make sure you look at their locations where you can spin up those VMs, because maybe you want something close for latency purposes. I know, like for my IRC bouncer and for Mumble and stuff, we like that, but definitely check them out today. And if you talk to anyone there, tell them you heard about it here on BSD Now.
And also say thank you for supporting FreeBSD.
Oh, yes, for sure.
Let's slow this guy's roll a little bit, This guy's shot his mouth off once too many, and it's all about DOS, baby. Anyway.
We were just talking about when Microsoft used to make a Unix until they started making DOS.
That's right, old Xenix.
Right. That's right.
I've got
blast from the past
manual somewhere, and actually, and I regret, there was a piece that was posted recently that I did not read that was kind of on my to-do list about a bit of the history there. It's an interesting history. I mean, there was a bit of a struggle inside of Microsoft because it turns out there actually were grown-ups there that understood that DOS was not actually an operating system and that they could actually make a real one. A bit of a tension there. But yeah, and we still have, for a long time, the clear command in the operating system had a gigantic Microsoft copyright. It was a one-line shell script, effectively, with a gigantic Microsoft copyright because it came from Xenix. Because we bought we bought a crazy little Unix company that people probably haven't heard of called Interactive Unix. So Interactive Unix is what became Solaris x86, and Interactive was a Xenix licensee or a System 3 licensee or something, some kooky. Who cares? This is so gross. Anyway, we ended up with Microsoft copyrights in the source space, which I always felt was wrong. But now we love Microsoft, apparently. Now Microsoft...
They've come full circle.
Apparently. I feel like those of us who remember the war are going to become an endangered species. I mean, it's kind of important that we not let these kids get too enthusiastic about Microsoft.
That's right.
They did try to rob humanity of its future. So, it is kind of important. All right, listen, curing malaria, fine. I'm down with curing malaria. I think it's great that Bill Gates is such a nice guy and
Clean
we can
water.
all dance now, but come on. Microsoft was a bad actor for many, many years. People need to go read. You know what they need is...
He's just making up for it. He's atoning for his past sins in any way he can.
Hey, listen, in stark contrast to certain other megalomaniac billionaires, right? So I'll take it. If every Oracle license would assure that we get further towards curing some disease that was not... the demise of Larry Ellison, then I think it would be all for it.
So he screwed over his son, but we cured cancer. So,
it's a bit of a wash. Okay, I'll take it. That's fine.
Oh, okay, we're recording. Okay, well, we're joined now by, of course, Brian Cantrill. Has been here a couple times, and we welcome you back, of course. So for those who don't know, he's the CTO of Joyent. So, gosh, I think everybody knows you at this point. So let's just get right to it. First of all, thanks for being here again today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here as always.
Okay, so Alan, you lead us off. What do you want to start with today?
Well, I guess, we took a little poll of FreeBSD developers earlier when I mentioned that you were going to be on the show and asked them what they wanted to hear you talk about. And a bunch of them picked this tweet you sent recently where it said, decades later, Linux is still broken in the same ways.
Yeah.
Explain.
Yeah, everything that was still wrong with Linux is still everything that's wrong with Linux. Yeah, so that was in reaction to a particular piece. Linux is having an issue, as operating systems do from time to time, with what's called on bug or bug on, right? It's bug on. And bug on is the Linux variant of what we have is Verify and Illumos. And I don't know what you have in BSD, but it is effectively a living assert. So an assert that's not compiled out. An assertion is asserting an invariant, and assertions are one of those things that one discovers post-pubescence. One discovers assertions as a software engineer as a very healthy thing, and we have assertions in the operating system. Historically, assertions were compiled out. We added a variant, and I'm sure BSD's got the same kind of thing.
We actually called them invariants.
There you go, invariants, perfect, right. So it's an invariant, we call it a verify, same kind of thing, where it's like, this should never be false. And if this is false, we need to crash the system. We actually need to reset the system because our state is entirely unknown. Because what we thought to be true is false. The invariants have become violated. And so Linux has a variant of this too, but they're so sick of the operating system crashing as a result of these. You're like, okay, if the operating system is crashing, you fix the bugs.
The bugs,
no, we don't fix the bugs. No, instead, we are going to emit a stack trace and simply drive on. So it's like... I'm trying in my older age. I'm trying to be less prejudicial, but you're making it so difficult.
Wasn't there a Simpsons episode where the the idiot lights come on or whatever, and he's like putting duct tape over him? That one's fixed.
Yeah, right. You fix that one. And it's so deeply, deeply, deeply wrong. It's so deeply wrong because it's an invariant of the system. And if this is wrong, you've got no idea what else is wrong. And you should view this as a precious opportunity. You have the opportunity to programmatically say an invariant has been violated, and I'm going to bring us down while we're in this discrete state. By the way, we'll take a crash dump of this. We will take an image of system memory, and we will be able to debug why the invariant was violated. And oftentimes, and actually the easiest bugs to find are when the violation of the invariant is close to the subsystem at hand. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes that's not the case, right? Oftentimes the invariant has been violated because something has gone wrong much further afield in the system. And actually the invariant is acting as a bit of a canary in the coal mine.
Sure.
But if you don't bring down the system, there's not a question about whether the system is healthy. The system is not healthy, and even to say that to use that metaphor is the wrong metaphor, because this isn't a biological system; it's a mathematical one. It's not that the system is unhealthy; the system is wrong. It is actually wrong, and anything it does now is potentially wrong and potentially devastating. I mean, God forbid,
right to the file system.
You write to the file system. Right. God forbid you do something where the data corruption, because that's what it is, in memory actually is able to escape out to persistent storage, and now you've actually lost someone's data. And now you've created a much, much, much more egregious problem, a much worse problem, and it's egregious and negligent because you didn't actually stop the system when you knew it was wrong. You tried to cover it up, basically. Mm-hmm. You tried to, there was a fire in the utility room, and you're like, well, let's say if I close the door and put a wet towel at the base of it, we should be fine. It's like, no, that building's going to burn down. I mean, if you see something, say something, right?
Right.
And, you have an opportunity here, and this is a mistake that people continue to make. They continue to make at all levels of the stack, I find, where they find that an error is something that they just want to go away. And so they just try to eat it. And, for certain kinds of errors that might make sense under certain kinds of situations, but not when those errors are programmatic errors, not when you know that the program itself is wrong. When the program is wrong, it's incumbent upon the program to kill itself, to commit seppuku, to ritually kill itself and present its body for the medical examiner to be able to figure out what was actually wrong, so P.S. you can fix the problem. And you can actually, I mean, if you have a rampant problem where you're dying on all these invariants being violated, well, that's an all-hands-on-deck situation to fix the actual problem. Debug the system. Don't try to cover it up. And it's just so nauseating.
But that ruins our uptime statistics.
Well, what's funny about that is it actually reminds me of an old quote about Windows admins versus Unix admins, right? On Windows, if something goes wrong, you just reboot and lose any chance of figuring out what happened or being able to examine the state of the system, right? On Unix, something goes wrong, you look at it and try to figure it out and stop it from ever happening again. You don't just reboot and hope it doesn't come back for a month.
Please debug it. And you see this again and again. We see this with many different kinds of systems, and we see the problems that we have found that are the most pernicious in production are in systems that have had an error, a programmatic error that they have attempted to eat, but that programmatic error has had widespread symptoms, and they end up in a failure mode that's much more difficult to debug. And because the reality is that a system that's failing fatally is a relatively easier problem to debug in that you have a starting point. Like, the invariant has been violated. You have the next question to ask. Why? What has violated the invariant? You've got a route to take when you're debugging a system. If the system has not failed, but just sucks, and you have no starting point, It's like when the system is just not behaving properly. And yet that can often be, and we've had this happen many times in the past, where the system sucks because there was an error that should have resulted in the system being reset that hasn't. And now you've got, for example, a connection that's actually a dead connection. And we are continuing to send data over a dead connection because of a programmatic error elsewhere in the system. And if we actually had taken a core and reset, one, the system would have come up, and then two, we would have been able to debug the situation, and now we're in a much more complicated situation to debug. So yeah, I mean, debug it, God damn it, please don't. And then, but to see it just kills me that, so Torvald, so what they're going to do is they are changing bug on, they're just going to search and replace. And if you read that email, I mean, like, you need to be like, have all sharp objects away from you. They are going to use, like, I know, SED can fix this bug.
Yes.
It's like, no, SED cannot fix this bug. So they're going to change every bug on to warn on. And it's like, there, I fixed it. It's like, and so now, if you actually have a Linux kernel programmer that has, I mean, that the poor right-thinking individual that is living in the ghetto of Linux, just trying to do the right thing, and has an actual legit bug on, if this happens, please panic the system, that is now just going to be turned into a warn on, and now you've actually introduced bugs effectively in systems, or certainly made any bugs that do exist in the subsystems much more difficult to debug. It's like, God, how dare you? Come on. I mean, aren't you old enough to, I mean, like Torvalds and I are about the same age. Like, do you still have this many hormones running through you that you think this is a good idea? I mean, don't you realize that, I mean, aren't we getting older and wiser? But, whatever. So,
hey, warn on with ButterFS. What could possibly
Oh,
be wrong?
God. Oh, man. Oh, God. Twitch. I do love the whole, like, the
It's okay. System D will recover it.
Yes, don't. Chris, there comes a point where it's just like you're just piling on here. You're just trying.
I'm sorry.
Like, can I actually make him pass out? I mean, are you two playing for a drinking game? Or are you going to see if you can actually?
I think we have a betting game on the side here.
At a time here.
See how long before we can make Cantrill stroke out live on the show?
Right, exactly. Like, is it normal? My vision is kind of fading right now. Is the white spots normal? Well, and I do love this whole ButterFS software RAID business, which has been a total disaster. They now have like absolute rampant data corruption, and I think what I do think that there's a bit of a misunderstanding that the data corruption from ButterFS, and I love the ButterFS tweet, by the way, that you may want to use ZFS until we fix this. It's like, we may just want to use ZFS. Thanks.
Forever.
Forever. Thank you. Not coming back on that one. But I think what people don't understand is that there is a culture that creates that. That's not simply like, oh, the bugs will be fixed. People love to just like, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Like that is that's the famous. Who even said that? Actually, is that an Eric Raymondism?
It might be. Someone like that.
Is
I
that
don't know specifically?
I mean, it's clearly like you just go through like the hit list of jackasses just trying to figure out who actually said that. But that is so deeply, deeply offensive and wrong that eyeballs don't actually debug problems, brains do, and these are not things that you can't crowdsource debugging a kernel panic. I mean, yes, getting more brains on the problem is great, but there are only so many brains that are actually going to have the expertise to debug these problems. And the idea that if we just have enough volume, if we have enough use, these bugs will magically fix themselves. It's like no, they actually won't. The other thing I think that is actively happening to Linux, I think this is the kind of the peril that they run, is that right-thinking individuals are not attracted to that culture. And so people, even if you're interested in file systems, are you going to go and you're 22? Are you going to go work on ButterFS, or are you going to go work on ZFS? If you are interested in operating systems, are you going to go to a culture that is replacing bug-ons with warn-ons, or are you going to go to the BSDs or to Illumos or what have you, where you've got cultures that are not just more innovative, but also more rigorous in their thinking? And I think that in an all open source world, there's total freedom of choice for technologists, and the differentiators become almost the cultures, and these cultures become self-perpetuating. And so I think there's a danger that you end up with ButterFSs over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I just wonder how many of these is it going to take before people kind of like connect the dots that there's actually there are broader differences than simply the technology.
What befuddled me was how they didn't catch this sooner, because the test case they did for it of, create the RAID Z and like DD zeros into one of the drives and then run a scrub.
Right.
The FreeBSD handbook has every new ZFS user do that on purpose to watch, to show them how a scrub works and repairs the data. Like our newbie guide has every user do that exact experiment to prove that ZFS works. And no one had ever done it with ButterFS? Ever? What?
Right. Well, and I think that this is the idea. Well, you wouldn't do it because it's not ready for production yet. It's like that. It would be mean to do that because it's not. It's like no.
That's just setting us up for failure.
When also that it doesn't understand what software is born ready for production or not. And if the software that is, especially software in the data path, it's not, you don't make it ready for production later. It's like security. You don't retrofit it onto an extant system. You either design it for production use or you don't. And it's not something that you asymptotically approach. I mean, yes, there will be bugs in the system, but the bugs in a system that is actually designed for production use, that is actually a salvageable system. Bugs in a system that was never actually designed for production use or thought that production use was something that would be done later or by the little people, it is not actually tenable. And with ZFS was, people don't realize this, that ZFS was designed to be used in production from day zero. So it's just that it didn't have features in the beginning. So sure. I mean, my home directory was on ZFS starting in, I want to say 2003, certainly by 2004 when we had a mail server, and the first time it was really ready, we all kind of piled on, and it was in production. Now, I mean, ZFS was still missing a lot of features. ZFS still had bugs for sure, but those bugs were not of the variant that corrupted data. ZFS's bugs were all of, and I mean, still, when we have bugs in ZFS, they tend to be of ZFS taking long vacations, mysterious vacations, from which ZFS always returned. But be like, oh, ZFS, where are you?
Right.
And so we had things like, big snapshot deletion, right? On big snapshot deletion, we'd be in syncing context forever. And ZFS would disappear for 45 minutes. Well, it
45 hours sometimes.
Snapshot.
Sure,
yeah, right,
sure.
Right. So this is something we fixed years ago. But that's the difference between a ZFS that had been run in production for a month and ZFS that's been run in production for a decade, not corrupting data versus not corrupting data.
Sure. How did no developer do the test? It's a 10-minute test.
Well, no developer does the test because that is not what the culture is. The culture is not around integrity. That's not integrity is something that's almost mean-spirited and inconvenient. I mean, my God, you might actually panic a running system. You might ruin the uptime numbers. I mean, how cruel to ruin the uptime numbers to panic a system that is actually suffering from data corruption. That whole zeitgeist is fundamentally flawed, and it's self-perpetuating in that it creates software that never becomes correct. So I think that it'll be interesting to see if that culture changes. I mean, the one thing I will give Torvalds credit for is total amnesia and no sense of needing to square new things.
Uh-oh. Did I lose you guys?
No, I'm still here.
No.
My past self and my present self can meet in the middle. Like, he feels none of that responsibility. So, I mean, he might, who knows, maybe, he will fall down in the shower and all of a sudden all the warn-ons will go back to bug-ons. I don't know. I mean, because this is the guy who did not believe in source code control as a point of principle, which is just like, what point of principle is that? So, no, did not believe in source code control as a point of principle, and yet is the inventor of Git. So,
Go figure.
I saw a hilarious tweet the other day. It's like, Linux is almost as if the guy who invented Git wrote an operating system.
Right. So would you say that they're just more into the feature bingo right now in the ButterFS land as opposed to
I think that
production bingo?
No, you know what? I honestly think that Linux is just not attracting people who are interested in OS development. I think that it is Linux is for people who view operating systems as done and uninteresting, and the operating system is something that's basically regrettable. I mean, there's been what innovation have we seen first in Linux? What OS innovation have we seen first in Linux? I struggle to come up with one, right? Because the innovators are elsewhere. So what people are using Linux for is like, look, we need an operating system for the phone, and we don't care what it is, or I just need to run. It's the same mentality that drove people towards Windows in the 90s, and they just don't care about the details. So I don't necessarily think they're being driven by features. I just don't think they're being driven by much at all. I mean, I think that Butterfs seems to be kind of, certainly with being encouraging people to run ZFS. And ZFS on Linux seems to have legs, which is great. I mean, obviously from a ZFS perspective, we really want to see ZFS on Linux. I think I have a newfound appreciation for just how immature ZFS. I mean, it was a little bit depressing at the ZFS Developer Summit how many of the ZFS on Linux presentations were essentially trying to add things to ZFS by reinventing facilities that already exist in other operating systems. Where you're just kind of like, why don't you you can kind of reconsider some larger choices here, but no, we have to. Okay, all right, whatever. So I mean, things around like fault management, around debugging, and so on, where so they're basically being dragged into, I would say, by being dragged into kind of modern operating systems. I don't think they're necessarily. I don't think it's a feature frenzy. I just don't think it's much of anything. But. I don't know. I mean, I've already spent too much airtime. I actually don't care that much. And every time I'm like, I'm beyond. I just don't care. Then there's something like the bug on thing where it's like, God damn it, now I do care. I'm trying not to care. Trying so hard not to care. Thank God for Twitter.
Every now and then the wind shifts and the dumpster fire smoke starts drifting across your lawn. You're like, dang it.
What the hell is that? God, that smells bad. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And again, thankfully, that 140 characters of stress relief. It's very healthy. I'm sure my kids implicitly appreciate it because, I don't come home and scream at them or do whatever I would do if I, locking all that rage up inside would be really very corrosive. So I'm glad that I can constantly release it.
Well, let's talk about something happier then.
Seriously, let's happy talk.
The OpenZFS Dev Summit.
Yeah, which was great. I mean, it was fun. It was, it's always fun to get that crew together, people from a bunch of different technologies. There's a bunch of different interesting stuff going on. I mean, I think that we are, one of the things that I like about where we are now versus, say, a decade ago is that these open source is so far along now that you got people from across different communities collaborating in kind of single open source communities. So we're getting a lot of great work in ZFS. I mean, I loved some of the crypto stuff that's happening now. ZFS. So ZFS does not have encrypted data at rest historically, and it's always been like that one checkbox item that we're missing. And you can definitely make an argument, and God knows I have, about the validity of encrypted data at rest, because if you need me to encrypt the data that I, the operating system, am putting to rest, that means that I'm the threat vector, that I'm the actual attack vector. I, the operating system, you do not trust me, and if you do not trust me, like, we're in deep trouble. Like, I'm in charge of running you. Like, I enqueue you to run on a CPU. Like, I restore your register state, dude. Like, if you do not trust me, we've got serious issues. You kind of have to trust me. So the idea that, like, we're going to encrypt data at rest, I've always felt like that's a bit dodgy.
Well,
I mean,
how often is your computer off for the data to be at rest?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think the case has always been, well, I want to be able to EOL these disk drives. I've been using these disk drives for years. I'm going to rip them out. I'm going to throw them out, and I want to be able to. Okay, that makes more sense. Now I'm taking them out of this trusted environment, the data center, running the trusted software, namely the operating system, and now I'm going to throw them in the untrusted dumpster. And I don't want someone to be able to get those disks. That makes sense. But there's always, if you've been on Wall Street, you know this. There's a little cottage industry actually around the actual destruction of disks. So they will actually annihilate your disks for you. And I swear at all these financial services firms, which are the only ones that actually spend the cash to go do this, because they basically throw it into this disk wood chipper that annihilates the disk into just particles. And I've never actually seen this happen, but I've heard that it is just like awesome to watch. I mean, of course, you're watching a disk eating machine.
Sure.
I mean, you're watching Diskzilla eat your storage. I mean, how awesome is that? And I swear that even if they had encrypted data at rest, I'd be like, I think we better destroy these anyway. I mean, I think it's just so awesome to watch. I don't think they want to. Because they always insist like, I better like see this disk into the hopper myself,
Sure.
so they can of course like watch Diskzilla devour the disk.
Because it comes down to like you're like the only reason you need the encryption at rest for that case is if the disk is say going to become defective, stop working, and you won't be able to erase it or something. But you're too cheap to destroy it. You want the warranty replacement. So you have to send it back.
Want the warranty replacement.
It's like, well, make up your mind. You want if you can either spare the couple $100 to just replace the disk and throw it in the wood chipper, or your data is not that important and you can RMA the disk anyway. It's a very
there's always been a little bit of right, and this is the netherworld that encrypted ZFS has always lived in. Everyone's like, and at PS, it's like a hard problem too, right? It's a hard problem. There's a lot of stuff to get right. Key management is a huge issue. So you have like hard problem, somewhat dubious use case. Like I kind of get it, but I think there's some counter arguments for it. And then this was true inside of Sun too, right? So inside of Sun, like the dream team did not get put on encrypted ZFS. Maybe the nightmare team got put on it. So there was an engineer that was doing this, and the engineer just did it totally wrong. So they went to go integrate it, and this would have been like 2009. They were ready to go integrate encrypted ZFS, and it's like, well, this is just done wrong. Totally wrong. Go back to the beginning, delete what you have. Like, this is the RM minus RF code review of like, we're actually going to destroy this repo. That's the code review. Code review over, repo destroyed. And so they actually had to go back and re-implement it, redesign it. Well, the problem is that by the time they were ready to integrate it, the operating system had actually closed. So if it had been done properly the first time, we actually would have had it in OpenZFS, ironically enough. And honestly, it'd be interesting to know, like, if you could go rewrite history, if we knew that the operating system was going to close, would we have let it in? No, I don't think so. No, I think we did the right thing by. I would say it wasn't me at all. Actually, it was the ZFS team did the right thing by forcing a total reset on that. We have not had it because it is the one thing that is in the closed proprietary copyrighted APIs Oracle Solaris that is not in OpenZFS.
Although what I found interesting about that is that they implemented it different than Oracle did, because when they originally were going to do the Oracle way, and then they found a bunch of problems with the Oracle way.
They found a bunch of problems with the Oracle way, and not surprisingly, honestly, because it was the same engineer that did the kind of the redo, and just trust me, this is not a surprise, and a total blessing, actually, honestly, that we had to do a kind of from scratch thinking, and this is Datto is the company behind it. Great to see them really contributing it back, and the engineer who's leading the charge on that it was super sharp. People should definitely go watch that presentation. I mean, I always find, I personally am of the type that I have when watching a security presentation, I have a very hard time. My brain wants to shut itself off. My brain is like, sleep is now. And it's like, no. And I have I remember we used to joke that the operating systems lecturer on Kerberos at school, you could put a crack addict to sleep with that lecture. And because it always felt like, you always feel like, okay, God, we're finally done. It's like, oh, no, wait a minute. But the attacker could compromise the ticket granting server. You're like, oh, God, no, please. Please, just let the attacker win. Okay, God, mercy. I want to go to bed. And because you're kind of like locked in that like mode where you keep like kind of drifting off and you're kind of waking up again. So I always kind of nod off during that stuff, even though I really, really want to pay attention. It's an important problem. So when you find someone who's really geared up on it, excited about it, and he was really engaged by it. So that was really fun to see. That was in many ways that was a real highlight of the conference.
He kept it high level enough that you could follow it without having to be an expert, but you could see that the detail was actually there.
The detail was actually there. No, I thought it was. I mean, that is as good a presentation on security that I've ever seen. I thought it was really good, and he's super young. I think I'm like sitting there like, I think he's like 23 or something. I don't know. But anyway, great. And I think also another thing that's great about it, and we're seeing this in a bunch of companies now and across the community, it is always great when you have people who are starting out their career, who are much younger than I am, much younger than we are, and watching them come in with the same kind of excitement, with the same values, and then better, like having new insights and new directions that they want to take things. I mean, that youth and energy is so vital to any open source community, and it's always really exciting to see. I mean, that I think is really, I mean, that's the future of the technology, right? So I think that for all of us to be able to work on a technology that is still serving to inspire young people, I think is really is terrific. And engineers again that are starting out their career, and we all remember when we were there, which doesn't feel like it was that long ago. And it's really exciting to see.
Cool. All right, which one are you going to go to next year?
When we were discussing this before, you mentioned the value of small communities, specifically around ZFS.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is way too much made about the size of a community and like how many GitHub stars do you have? It's like, I don't care. It's like, I care so much more about the quality of a community than the quantity of a community. And at Joyent, we've kind of had an interesting experience where we participated in a bunch of different communities. We participate obviously in the Lumos community, in the SmartOS community. We participate in the Node community, the Node.js community. We were, as Ryan Dahl worked for Joyent, and we were the company behind Node for a long time. And then we participated in lots of communities in between, Postgres community, a bunch of others. And so we see a bunch of different communities, and boy, especially with Node, you see the curse of a large community. A large community is as much curse than blessing, because it's really hard to have a large community that really crisply shares values. Those values become stretched more and more as the community gets larger and larger, and then you get to the point where you hit Node, and honestly, like Node just doesn't share values. And that's what it boils down to. And a major reason that Node does not live at Joyent anymore and lives in a foundation is because we do not share values. And it took me a long time to kind of come to that, because it's a tough conclusion to come to. But what's harder to come to is that we don't share values, and that's actually okay. That our values and your values, not yours, but your values and someone else's values should be able to coexist on the planet, but not in this, that we can't be in the same community, or it's really hard to be in the same community because we want to take the technology in two different directions. And we want to take it in a way that's consistent with our values, which is really much more around durability, reliability, debuggability, observability, around making actually rugged infrastructure, versus doing whatever dumbass JavaScript thing. Sorry, it still sounded like a value judgment, didn't it? We saw this in the JavaScript community. We've seen this with promises, which if you don't know about, I don't even want to burden you with. But suffice it to say, it's a different way of dealing with the asynchrony of JavaScript, but in a way that to us is totally undebuggable and has these failure modes where it's like, how are you going to actually debug that in production? But it was the other folks in the community just didn't care about that. They don't value debugging things in production. They don't value even necessarily running things in production. I was talking to a friend of mine who was in New York, and she was talking to someone else. Apparently, I came up in conversation. That Cantrill guy, he cares way too much about production systems. And it's like, oh, yeah, no, I'm totally with you. I care way too much about reality. I'm so fucking sorry that I care about actually running real systems. I have my profound apologies for my stubborn reality centrism. I'm so goddamn sorry. So, there's that.
Well, outside of production, what exists?
Well, that's the thing.
There's a classroom, right? And it's just a lab.
Well,
and it's not meant to
there's
ever be
like
really
my laptop while I'm developing, but that's
to me, like the opposite of production is autoeroticism. And which isn't to say that's wrong. Like I honor that. It's just different part of your life that we don't bring to work. The production systems are what we are actually developing. That is the stuff that we are engineering. That is the stuff that ultimately makes a difference in people's lives. I mean, which is ultimately what we're trying to do, right? Ultimately, we are trying to build this substrate of technology, these towers of technology that ultimately allow people to build useful things. That has to be the outcome. And to be useful, it has to run in production. So yeah, I mean, just to me, like, there is no other. But I think to get to kind of, back to the point about the smaller communities, I think that when you have a smaller community, it's easier to share those values. And I mean, the ZFS community is a self-selecting community of shared values. And as a result, I don't care how many people are at a ZFS meetup. I don't care if that's not how I judge it. I care if 3 people show up, it's 3 people that I have something in common with. Mm-hmm. And I feel that way about all of the smaller communities that we're in. I kind of have disdain for people who can heap scorn on communities that are small, because I think that they don't understand that actually there's value to that smallness. It's like being in a small town, sure. But even more so because it is so much about these shared values. And when we're small, frankly, it's like there is less to disagree about because we so do crisply share values, and it's more uplifting. And I think that way too much is made of the size of the community versus the quality. And I think that there are a lot of these great small communities out here, and there are great big communities too. But I think that that's harder.
Well, just to the number of different conferences I've gone to, I've definitely enjoyed the ones with under 300 people a lot more than any of the huge ones.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's like I want to feel like I talked to almost everybody that was here, and that I actually recognize some of the people, and that they have, that I can walk up to some people and that they'll want to talk about the same thing I want to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that you want to see the world, you want similarly enough that you can then share meaningful experience. I mean, I want to have different experiences, but be bound by common values.
Sure.
And that's the trick. And I think that if you begin to not have those shared values, that's when the nerd rage starts to kick in.
Five people with a shared goal will get much farther than 100 people who argue about what the goal should be. Just every time.
Totally. And so I think that, and the value of these communities is that they are totally comfortable about completely sharing these values. And because the other thing that I just hate in open source communities, I do feel that this is especially true over in container mayhem, which we obviously deal with a lot at Joyent, but the idea that there are going to be winners and losers, or there's just going to be a winner and everyone else will be a loser. I think that some people have this idea of kind of like, who's going to be the VMware of containers? It's like, well, what if there isn't one? Like, what if there isn't actually a single winner? I think in an all open source world, I don't think there is going to be one winner. I think that there are going to be many different winners. I think that there are going to be, in fact, that's the wrong way to even think about it. I think that the idea that one technology is going to conquer all other technologies, I think that is a very dated kind of 90s-ism. And I don't think that's the world we live in. I think the world of the future looks a lot more like programming languages, like databases, like operating systems too, where there are lots of different choices to make, and you pick the right tool for the job. So I don't think we're going to have single winners in these domains, and I think it's a mistake for people to believe that there are going to be these single winners.
I think it's actively dangerous. As if the last 30 years have taught us anything, it's monocultures are bad, right? OpenSSL. Yeah. We really wish there was an alternative.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Why did we let all the alternatives die off? That was a bad plan.
That was a bad. No, that is a really good argument. That is a really good example, because OpenSSL is, and people now know OpenSSL is terrible because like, oh yeah, vulnerability of the week. It's like, well, not exactly but yeah, definitely vulnerability of the week. But for people we were in that code a decade ago, you could see that was going to happen because that code is atrocious. I mean, so a body of software that I wrote a while ago that I still love and use is the ability to take a core dump and find memory leaks. So I wrote this thing called Find Leaks for our debugger that would basically garbage collect the core dump for a C-based system and find objects that are not referenced. And when we turn on the debugging mode of the allocator, we know where these things were allocated, so we can report like this stack with the object with this stack trace has been leaked. It's great. And so we would use this all the time in C-based systems. This is terrific. And so we had a C-based system that incorporated OpenSSL, and there were just leaks all over the place with OpenSSL. And general, like, I love memory leaks, right? I love memory leaks. I mean, I don't love the actual leaking of memory. I love fixing memory leaks because they're often really straightforward. It's pretty easy. Like, you find the error path, like, there's just the error path. I forgot to free this thing. And you can make a change that's a totally robust, obviously correct change. It's clearly advancing the system. And it's like one of those things. Leaks are those things that I go fix when I'm just like depressed about everything else. And I can just go make some. You need like those things to like keep you moving forward, right? Making forward progress. So I'm just like, I'll just go fix some of these OpenSSL leaks. And so you're like, okay, fine. So you go into the routine and you find that, sure enough, something is not being freed in an error path. But then you realize that so now you need to actually like propagate this error, free this thing or what have you. And you're trying to propagate an error out and you realize that you're in a function that returns void. And you're like, okay. So this is a function that can fail in 18 different ways but returns void. And if you don't propagate that failure, you've got no way of freeing the thing at the higher level. It's like, okay, all right. So fine. We're going to change that to return an error code. And how many places is that being called in? Please be called in only 3 places. Okay, it's called in 4 places. Or it's like, okay, fine. That's called by a function that then also returns void. And you're like, okay. And you kind of, you go to cscope this stuff, and you finally get to the function that is like, this is all void functions calling void functions calling void functions. Like the whole idea that something could go wrong and, either an allocation could fail or what have you is just totally, was just not designed with that in mind at all. And trying to retrofit that on was just obviously going to be impossible. And you realize that, like, man, there's so much smoke when you are not properly propagating error conditions. You know that there's fire. You know that there are deeper issues. You know that it's unlikely they got these deeper issues right. So it wasn't a surprise when the OpenSSL stuff started dropping. Some of it was like, wow, that is actually surprisingly egregious. It's actually like it's totally. And I'm sorry to go here, but it is a singular election that we're seeing. It totally is like the Trump outtakes, where it's like, okay, I knew that there'd be vulgar outtakes, but like, wow, that's even more vulgar than I thought it would be. That's stunningly vulgar. And I feel it's the same way with OpenSSL. It's like, okay, you know that there are going to be vulnerabilities, but like, wow, that is actually really brazen. That's even worse than I thought it was going to be. And roll on LibreSSL. Is LibreSSL, am I just dreaming the dream? Is that thing actually going to,
I think it's got a future.
Well,
is it going to save us all? All right.
Maybe. Like, it's just a fork of OpenSSL, but it has the newer API. That's will eventually someday mean you can write an app without having to use the terrible API. But yeah, some of the guts are still there, I think.
We need the RM-RF fork of OpenSSL. And I really do think that needs to be a from scratch rewrite. Hopefully someone is excited by that problem, because it's a hard problem to solve. But no, Alan, to your point about that, it is the monoculture that created that. And people want that monoculture because it's a problem they don't want to solve. Sure. And I understand that. But when you accidentally create the monoculture, when you care so little about the problem that you have effectively single sourced the solution, then you've got these risks that are now systemic risks almost because of the monoculture. So I do think it's a danger when we do approach that monoculture. Fortunately, I think especially in the open source world, this is the beauty about open source, where we're not relying on necessarily the livelihood of companies to preserve heterogeneity, that we're only relying on the software itself, that as the monocultures get broken, they don't get reconstructed generally, which I think is at least it gives reason for optimism.
Yep.
Cool. All right, so next topic, let's throw it out here. So cooperation between Lumos and FreeBSD.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, so what are you seeing going on there? I know we've talked a little bit about the bootloader, for example.
That's been huge for us. UEFI, this is an attack on humanity by the ghost of Bill Gates, right? It's I feel like ultimately it is still the BIOS vendors that actually are holding humanity hostage. It is just amazing to me the degree to which AMI is actually the existential threat to humanity. And everyone is letting this little tiny company put push humanity around. Anyway, it's very frustrating. And UEFI is a huge source of frustration because, I mean, we all need to boot on hardware. So it's been huge for us to basically be able to collaborate on that. I mean, and I put collaborate kind of loosely because we're really taking advantage of the FreeBSD work.
Well,
but
a lot of the
Well, you gave us ZFS, we
right,
gave you
exactly.
a bootloader, it's fine.
Right. I kind of feel that, like, hey, we were the leads on ZFS and dtrace. Now that's in FreeBSD. You guys led the charge on the bootloader, and now we're using that. And I think that this is, I think that there's a lot of really healthy cross-pollination between the communities, and I think that should continue. I mean, I think I like having the disjoint communities because they do have distinct histories and there are distinctions there. But I also think it's tremendously valuable to have the cross-pollination, and it's not always cross-pollination of technology. I think that one of the things I saw in FreeBSD 11 is the jails. They are finally making the shared memory, the System 5 shared memory is finally jail aware. And I believe I can claim some fraction of credit for that because I think that might be because of the papers we love I did comparing doing the jails paper and the zones paper, which I love doing. It was really interesting to contrast jails and zones, compare and contrast kind of the different design centers there and looking at the history. But I was I kind of couldn't believe that the shared memory was not jail aware. And I'm glad it is now.
Yeah,
I mean, that's great.
There was some work before on it, but it kind of stalled out. And I think
it kind of dwindled, right?
and then your talk got someone new excited about it, and then it was done.
Which is great. That is so exciting. I mean, it is great. One of the things and this is just the new age we live in. I mean, to think that we're only kind of 10 years into the post-YouTube age, which is amazing. It feels like we've had it forever. But we didn't really have a way of communicating this stuff, really. I mean, I guess we did it via kind of conferences a little bit.
Yeah, you had to travel.
Or like mail order the DVD after the conference.
Disjointed IRC conversations.
Right. I mean, God, this is what we are living fossils, guys. This is where we sound so goddamn old. I mean, it's so embarrassing. When I tried to describe that era, you're like, wow, that is not, and it's not that long ago. That's the amazing thing. But to be able to, I think one of the great things today is that be able to serve as an inspiration to someone who you can't say, who's who you've never met, who watches a presentation you gave, and maybe you've inspired them in some not even a direct way, but like you talked about this problem, and I got excited about the problem. I mean, you didn't even necessarily inspire me to do it, but you pointed me to the problem, and that's great. I think to be able to have that kind of influence. I mean, and I think it's indisputably making things go faster and better to be able to influence one another in that regard. So I'm glad that to the degree that I was able to influence it all, it's great, and it's great to see that in FreeBSD 11, and great to see. I think obviously we're a huge believer in proper container technology, jails and containers, jails and zones. So roll on.
Yeah, cool. There was quite a bit of other stuff happening. The localization support came from Illumos and went into FreeBSD and DragonFly BSD, where bugs were found, and then the fixes were pushed back up into Illumos.
Great! Oh, cool. That's
even
great.
The bootloader, that didn't just come wholesale from FreeBSD. Tumis did a whole bunch of work to improve it on FreeBSD before bringing it over, including our support for reading off FAT32 was very slow because nobody boots FreeBSD from FAT32. But right. Illumos, you pulled out big image, and so that became a thing. And so a lot of work went both ways there, including I think the reason he and I started working together so closely was I started working on implementing selecting ZFS boot environments from the FreeBSD loaders menu, and he was like, "Well, yeah, we want that feature too." Although on the Illumos they implemented it slightly differently, but we collaborated with that and. We really enjoyed having another person who could write forth, so I didn't have to.
Can we just get rid of that? Oh, come on.
Now, come on now.
Speaking as one who's had to do some forth.
Fourth is mother's milk. Fourth,
there's another one, Alan.
I love fourth. And fourth is so tight. And because PostScript is essentially a fourth derivative. Bonwick used to write his presentations in PostScript. Do you know this? So And even by the time I came along in the mid-90s, I'm like, why don't you use FrameMaker for that?
Oh no, the feed stalled.
Justify, like, that's the right way to do it. He's like, it renders so much faster, which, I mean, admittedly, like, Bonwicks, I mean, they would print ridiculously fast. I had no idea that a printer could go that fast when you would print it out or you like display it on the screen. I mean, it was like being punched in the jaw because it was all raw PostScript. I mean, it was like, and his presentation was like 5K because it's a program. You know, it's a 5K PostScript program. But, you know, I just have too many fond memories of programming my HP calculator. That's in fourth. I think that's what fourth evokes in me. I mean, I get to the HP 42S, HP 48G, and I know I don't care that I'm a fossil. I don't care. That's fine. I don't care. And I know it's all like the TI. Was it TI 85 now? Just sickening to me.
It's a different generation. You know, the baby boomers had like their favorite rock groups, and for us, it's like, do you remember that calculator?
Oh, God. Remember? I mean, infix notation is just disgusting to me. I mean, it is just disgusting. How could you possibly? And I mean, I remember, you know, saving up for my summer job so I could buy an HP 48 calculator. I'm listening to myself right now. I just sound ridiculous. But whatever. It's history. It happened, you know. And actually, in that HP 48G, I had a, I had, that was an infamous calculator for me. Did you have an HP 48?
I did not. No.
You guys have this generation? This was a monster. So this was this was like the first. It was an early graphing calculator. It could take these like modules. It had this crazy ass microprocessor in it, the Saturn. You could write software for it. Like you could get Pac-Man for the calculator. Which was awesome. It was a great community. So much fun. And I was taking a linear algebra class, my linear algebra class, and I had this prof, incredibly annoying prof. And this is kind of prof, like classic math prof, who would spend 20 minutes explaining the thing that's actually completely obvious and then skip over like 6 steps in the proof. And basically the only questions he was really entertaining were questions about things that were pretty much had obvious answers. And so he was kind of insufferable, and he had I remember the first lecture. Sorry, I'm going on a long tangent here. But the first lecture, he had this extended calculator policy that basically boiled down to you can't use calculators, which made sense. It's like it's linear algebra. My calculator could take this course. Of course, so it made sense. But he had this go on for hours about how you can't use calculators. All right, fine. So we get to the midterm. And there's a person in the class that would always ask like the question that he had already answered exhaustively, and you're just like, oh, please don't ask that. He's going to go off again. And so this person raises their hand and says, hey, can we use calculators in the midterm? And you're like, no, of course we can't use calculators in the midterm. You idiot, don't ask that question. And he says, oh yeah, sure, you can use calculators. He had this kind of whiny voice. I'm like, what? He's like, you can use a calculator. It's like, okay, what? You had this whole this 20-minute lecture on day one about how we can't use calculators. So I raised my hand. I'm like, we can use calculators. Yeah, you can use calculators. But I'm asking this question one more time. Are you sure we can use? Yes, you can use calculators. But if you don't show all your work, blah, 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 you get the answer wrong. Yeah. All right, fine. So I'm like, all right, I need 3-phase power so I can plug in my HP 40. If we're gonna I could just wheel in. Like, is there a room with AC around here, like, so I could actually like cool my HP 48G so it can take this exam? So in the linear algebra, you had that kind of classic taking a matrix to some high power, and you gotta like invert the matrix and take the eigenvalues and multiply all that together, whatever, and you gotta leave it as a product of these kind of 3 giant matrices, and admittedly, I decided that I was really not interested in doing all that work. So I wrote down all the steps that you would do. And then I said, or just do it in your head. And I had the HP 48G do this. It was a 10 by 10 matrix to, I think, the 10th power. And I had this thing crunched. The thing took, this is in 1994, the thing took like 45 seconds to grind out this answer. And it was this 10 by 10 matrix that had like 13-digit numbers in it. And so I handed my exam, and the exams come back, and he is like, one of you has betrayed my trust. And you're like, okay,
oh, no.
Someone cheated on the exam. And he goes off on this like speech about betrayal. I begin to think like, is this me he's talking about? Is he talking about my exam? And sure enough, because this guy had never used a computer ever, basically, classic mid-90s math prof, He didn't know what that matrix was taken to the 10th power, and he had to calculate it all longhand on the back of my exam, was covered with and so clearly wanted me to slip a digit on that, which I obviously didn't do. Anyway, long story. But
Did he retire the next week? Like, I'm done.
It's even worse. He did not get tenure. So, and I think in retrospect, he had not gotten tenure earlier in the semester and was just using us as part of his own Stanford prison experiment. So I think he had kind of turned sadist early. But maybe related to why I didn't get tenure. Anyway, this is why I think that this is a long fourth story. This is why
the longest fourth story ever.
Oh, I'm sure this is not. I think if you mention fourth, there is a generation of technologists who will just begin to describe their childhood. I think it has that kind of effect on people. But anyway, I'm glad we got the fourth. I'm glad, and we got the Sun font. We got the old school Sun font. At least we found the font that was what the old Spark boxes would use when they boot. So it's a very kind of retro feel to it, which is fun.
Sure.
Cool. So you mentioned papers we love, so that obviously brings us to systems we love.
Yes, very excited about systems we love. So first of all, love Papers We Love. I don't know if you guys have been to a Papers We Love meetup, but they're happening everywhere. It is a great movement, a huge tribute to those folks who wanted to actually discuss papers and have a journal club. There's a lot of great research out there. And, one of the things that kind of a long troll of mine is that academic computer science conferences have become totally practitioner hostile. In fact, UNIX actually made a total mistake. So you may recall I gave this Fork Yeah Lumos talk at the UNIX Lisa in 2011 that became something of an infamous talk. This is where I was rather unvarnished with my opinions about Oracle. And recall that this talk, the Lisa talk, UNIX Lisa talk, did not go online for many weeks. And everyone thought it was a conspiracy and so on. Of course, I thought it was just incompetence. And when it finally did come online, it actually had this disclaimer that had never been on any Unix video about the following views are not the views of the Unix Association. And they had taken that disclaimer and mashed it up and put it above my head the entire time I'm speaking, just so you know that these views, that I'm a total renegade. Anyway, they made a huge mistake of inviting me back to keynote their annual technical conference this year. And I'm like, this is on you, man. You should figure that out. Like, if you don't know what I'm bringing, it wasn't actually video, but it was recorded. And I use that as an opportunity to for a rant that I've been meaning to have for a long time, which is how academic computer science has ruined the academic practitioner relationship with a conference system that is totally screwed up. So academic computer science uses conferences as the publishing vector, which is just totally wrong. No other scientific discipline does it this way. So anyway, I gave this talk, and what I view, and this is a long way getting to systems we love, but part of the reason I don't like that is because it makes conferences fundamentally very negative. It's about kind of who gets into these conferences. And so you don't actually have a lot of the discussion happening there. Papers We Love is picking up some of this best research and then talking about it with practitioners, which to me is much more fruitful. I was a little dismayed by how few academics had heard of Papers We Love, but hopefully that's changing. So I love Papers We Love. I think it's great. But I didn't want to restrict it to just papers. Like, why not? Let's talk about some of the systems that we love. And also, let's talk about the things that are the technologies, these small communities that don't necessarily have their own conference or for whom their own conference doesn't make sense. Let's give these technologies an outlet to talk about what they love and what motivates them. So we pulled together systems we love. I made the mistake of tweeting out that, should we do this, which is totally a mistake. This is where you need to rest for a minute before you tweet that out. Because immediately you were like, oh, great, when is it? I'm going to booking travel. It's like,
committed.
Yeah,
I'm already booking a flight. I don't even know where.
And so but we said there was such an overwhelming response, like, okay, we obviously have to do this. So we put it together. It's coming up. It's in December. Systems We Love, systemswe.love even. The submission is actually, if you're listening to this live, you're listening to this recorded, I'm sure this won't be available for a while, but if you're listening to this live, the submissions are due in a week, less than a week. So definitely get the submissions out there. We've got an amazing program committee. I've been really lucky to pull together a ton of folks from a ton of different communities, and a lot of great submissions so far. So I think this will be great. I think it's people talking about the systems that they love, because I mean, loving systems, which ultimately, I mean, that's certainly a bond that the three of us share. Mm-hmm. Loving systems is a kind of a peculiar thing. And it took me years to realize that is my precise affliction. Because when I was a kid, I actually thought I wanted to be an economist. I really loved economics, and then did what I thought was this hard right turn into computer science. And what I then realized kind of years later is actually what I'm really interested in is systems, and software systems are just the purest distillation of that. And that's what is so exciting about software systems, is that they're discrete, they're tight, you can reason about them, you can improve them, unlike more complicated systems with more humans in the loop, which are much more difficult to kind of reason about and reform. So we're really excited for Systems We Love. I think there's going to be a bunch of interesting stuff there. I've just, like I said, taken a peek at the submissions and really looking forward to it. So it's pretty great.
Oh, that's neat.
So if we have time, we have a couple of questions from the chat room.
Oh, you bet. Yeah. That's kind.
So they asked about Illumis's firewall, which I guess is still IPF.
It is still IPF.
And Oracle's been importing PF into their Solaris. Would Illumos be interested in something like that?
Yeah, we'd be really interested in something like that. I mean, IPF it's been a problem for us. So it's been a work in progress, to put it mildly. We would love PF. We would love PF. And again, just twitching that, of course, by Oracle taking PF, that's not work that we can use, and it's not work that they're going to open source. And so wrong. Anyway, but yeah, we'd love that. I think that is it's a direction we're going to ultimately need to go in. IPF has definitely been a source of issues for us. I mean, as always, it's complicated because we use IPF for the firewall that we implement as part of the Giant Cloud. So it would be a complicated transition to make, but I think we're going to need to make in the limit, and we would love to see PF and Illumos for sure.
Cool. So next one was, what do you have? Any thoughts on Apple's new file system, AFS?
Yeah. I think that in the Valley anyway, Apple did invent the term NIH, or NIH is commonly ascribed to Apple. NIH, the not invented here syndrome. I think that's what we're seeing, the NIH flag flying high with the Apple file system. There are some, I would say, pretty deep philosophical differences between ZFS and the Apple file system. Mm-hmm. One certainly is around the reliability of hardware. The Apple file system has the somewhat peculiar notion that hardware is reliable, and it believes in magical hardware. It's
because it's Apple hardware, of course.
It's Apple hardware. It has to be magical. And I've stopped believing in magical hardware a long time ago. I don't like magical hardware. In fact, you could say that the foundational principle of ZFS is smart software in lieu of smart hardware. Mm-hmm. And we kind of knew that going in, but boy, and I'm sure you guys have your own stories where you've got ZFS on a LUN that is putatively from this very expensive SAN, and ZFS starts reporting data corruption, and everyone says, well, it can't be this from the SAN because I paid so much money for it. It's like, if the SAN is corrupting my data, then what did I pay so much money for? You're like, well, this is awkward.
So you better sit down for this.
You may want to sit down for this, right? You may want to. And honestly, what you learn, as you become a veteran in the storage industry, you learn that what you're paying for is not data integrity. What you're paying for is the privilege to watch a storage vendor's SVP of sales lie down naked in the fetal position, weeping softly, begging for forgiveness from you. That's what you're paying for. And if you're the kind of sadist that gets off on that kind of thing, then okay, great. But for the rest of us, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I think that that's a very kind of core difference in belief. That and it's really designed around that company is so welded on to the client. The ghost of Steve Jobs still walks the place for sure, because you think that they got the raw goods to do interesting stuff server side, but they just don't. And it's my understanding that it's really kind of welded around not just magical devices, but kind of small numbers of magical devices. So, Adam Leventhal, my longtime co-conspirator, did a great piece on it on dtrace.org. Dtrace.org, kind of a blog that I threw together in as we were, leaving Oracle, that I still need to kind of like clean up and get on better infrastructure. But every once in a while, I'll get on Hacker News and see dtrace.org as the top story. I'm like, oh, okay, Adam has posted something interesting. So Adam had a great series of blog entries on the Apple file system where he really kind of took it apart. But I would say that it's, obviously, free to be you and me. Is it open source? I don't think it's open.
They claim that they might open source it some years from now.
They claim that they might. Yeah, that's nice.
I agree that's not
Exactly.
anything. That doesn't mean anything. That is like that, put a ring on it or don't.
That's like when I tell my kids, like, I'll think about whether I'll let you do that. That usually,
right, exactly.
No.
Right. And that works with kids for a while. I definitely remember when my kids were at the age where they say, I want this for my birthday. And I would say, okay, noted. I would look deliberate, noted. They'd be like, okay, he paid attention. I'm like, not paid attention at all. But that doesn't work anymore. So, yeah, they might open source it in the future, don't care. So, open source it or don't.
Also, I don't think it contains anything novel enough for it to be that useful to be open.
And certainly not if it relies on magical hardware.
It's like, we'll check some of the metadata, but not the data because magical hardware.
Right. And I just don't understand. The ZFS arguments, and clearly, they were making, and we saw this in Linux too, licensing arguments are usually a proxy for technical NIH, right? I just actually don't feel like adopting this change. And a licensing is a convenient way to do that. So I don't know what arguments they made internally to not use ZFS, but they're probably not very good ones. So that's a shame. It'd be great to see. I wish we could have ZFS on the laptop. It would be great. But, honestly, I think that Apple is kind of drifting in the post-Jobs Apple. We kind of saw that movie before, and we're seeing it again. And I honestly think that one of the ideas that was floated to me post Samsung acquisition is, hey, you guys should take a Samsung laptop and commit to it, get the driver support for it, and allow me to run SmartOS on the laptop. And it shows my character flaws that I think to myself, that's intriguing. It's like, no, that's a dangerous idea. Don't do it. But no, that's I do SmartOS on a laptop. But the only reason that's tempting is because I do feel they've kind of lost the plot a little bit. So
the very first line I ever wrote for the ZFS book that Michael Lucas and I did was, your disks are plotting against you, and ZFS is the only thing that can put an end to their treachery.
That is true. If only the disks were that smart. It's like they're not even. It's like the dog is pooping on the rug. Not because the dog doesn't even know it's a rug. It just doesn't. Right. It's a dog. And unfortunately, there are tens of thousands of dogs. And no, it is. I think people don't realize how bad it is, and how firmware really is the single greatest threat to humanity. They do not understand how, and also people think that the disk pathologies are kind of gentlemanly. They think that disks commit ritual suicide, and that's not what they do at all. They just start giving you they give you the wrong answer. They give you the wrong block. They take forever. We had a problem with the. Seagate. Oh God. When you could remember firmware IDs, that's a problem. Like SU0D is scored in my brain. SU0D was for Seagate, the Seagate Barracuda drives, and there was a firmware bug where it was a logic bug in the head where it would misapply the polarity of voltage to when it wanted to decelerate the head, and it would attempt to accelerate the head when you got to high LBAs. And the controller would realize that this is about to happen. It's like, no, you do not mean that. Like, that will actually destroy the drive, and it would reset the drive. So you would have this 650 millisecond outlier while the drive boots. And the pathology of this would be, this was much more likely, it was ultimately a race condition effectively. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it was ultimately a firmware bug, but it was ultimately much more likely at high LBAs. So you would have this thing where it'd be like, you'd be fine, you'd be happy, everything would work. And all of a sudden one drive would begin to have these like outliers, and then like 2 drives, and then 15 drives, and then you're actually crying. And so you need stuff like that where it's like the drive is actually rebooting. That's a really nasty pathology, and your hardware. It is you against the hardware, and ZFS is your only hope when it comes to storage hardware. That's for sure.
Yeah. Although it doesn't help when the disk controller just decides you don't have any disks anymore.
Then you've got that. Like, what disks? What are you talking
you reboot
about?
the machine, and it's like, no, there are no hard drives. And then you power it off for a while,
yes.
power back on. Suddenly, hey, there's hard drives again.
I almost know
those discs.
Yeah, we actually are dealing with a vendor now that's got a firmware bug where the drives disappear, and when the drives disappear, there are OS conditions that can lead to that. But then it does take resetting the box. When you power cycle the box, the drives reappear. You're like, okay,
I have one where when you power cycle, it didn't. It had to like cool off or something. I don't know. It was the weirdest thing ever.
Right. And like on the one hand, it gives you the solace of like, this is not a software bug, not the software we control anyway, not in the OS.
When the BIOS doesn't see the drives anymore, not my operating system's fault.
And not your operating system's fault. No.
Oh man, what a mess.
That's DOS's fault.
So I think the last one we had here, somebody wanted your thoughts on vulnerabilities, correctness, or security overall in Lumos.
Oh yeah, interesting. I think that I'd say we designed the security as a constraint. So and especially for us, because we do run, as with jails, running containers on the metal it does mean that you have to take security very, very seriously.
Sure.
And which is not to say that we've been without vulnerability, or that I would say that I'm sure that sadly there will always be vulnerabilities in software, but certainly we have. And actually, I've got to give a real tip of the hat to the ZDI, the Zero Day Initiative. Was HP, now someone else. I don't know where. It was one like the best thing HP was doing was the Zero Day Initiative, where they incentivize security researchers to find these things and funnel them back, which has been huge for us. And that's been. We've had because we've had a small number, and obviously not a. We take them all very seriously, but ZDI has been really helpful for that, and has been and there have been security researchers that we've worked with pretty extensively through ZDI, and it's always of some solace when you see the creativity of some of these exploits, where you're like, wow, that was because and often what they do is, which you just have to admire the creativity. It's often, especially in mature software like Illumos, it's not one vulnerability. It's like it's like 2 bugs that they're using in unison with a third that only leaks information. So you get a bug that's kind of innocuous that just leaks information, but not information that you can really use until you've got these other 2 bugs that you use in tandem, and now you use all 3 of those bugs together to develop an exploit, which is really. It's crafty when you find them. It requires some. It always because you want your software to not have any vulnerabilities at all. So when we do find out about these, there is that feeling of just total inferiority, and you feel, because like, oh my God, we've got but then you feel like, okay, I'm just thankful that we found this thing the right way and get it kind of resolved. And ultimately, that has to be your disposition, that we're, that the exploits wanted. I think that we've got a very robust substrate, one that we've got a lot of confidence in. But that confidence only comes from being able to really attack these vulnerabilities when they exist. And I think that, structurally, I don't think we've got issues. I think things have been built the right way. I think that zones are robust and secure by design. I think we've got lots of things that help limit penetration and so on. So the flip side is we were looking at one of these exploits where they were using a bunch of our debugging tooling to help them develop the exploit. And they had a comment like, man, I love developing exploits on this operating system. He's like, the tooling is amazing. And you're kind of like, okay.
Okay, thanks.
Right. Thanks, I guess. Like, oh, God. I mean, this is really all the tooling that I believe so fervently in is actually being used. But then you have to be like, no, this is actually good. This is actually good. You want it to be easy to find these things so we can fix them in the right way and so on. So, yeah, I wish we were without vulnerability, obviously, but I think we've got the right architecture, but they're always going to be out there.
Dtrace is the best rootkit ever.
It is. I know. It is. And it really is. I mean, I think people sometimes don't realize that what it means to have dtrace in the global zone. I mean, no, it's like you can see everything. I mean, that's by design. So, and then we've obviously got a lot of things that limit how you are able to use that power. But it is designed to allow you to see everything.
That's right.
So
that's still a good thing. Transparency.
That's right.
Well, exactly. Paul Hennenkamp, when we interviewed him about jails, he said one of the best things about jails is that, if there's an attacker in the jail, as the sysadmin in the global zone, you have like one of those police interview room two-way mirror things going on. You can see in what they're doing, but unlike with the regular system, they can't tell you that you're looking, right? You're not connecting in. You're looking through this two-way mirror, and they have no idea that they're being observed.
Yeah, they don't. And so one of the things that we have actually, especially with LX, where we've got a Linux system call table, and can actually run a Linux stack. One of the things that I would like to actually do, I haven't had a chance to do yet, is throw out some honeypots out there that are LX zones that we can actually observe attackers, because you can make this an incredible intrusion detection system by leveraging that incredible power from the global zone. And actually, we did have a situation where we were developing LX, and we saw one of the things we do is whenever a program dumps core, we take those core dumps and collect them, and we've got a system in Manta that actually allows us to analyze them. And I noticed that there were all these core dumps from IP tables. I'm like, what the hell is that about? And you look at the core dump, and it makes no sense. I mean, it looks like no sense in that it's just like clearly dereferencing a null pointer or doing something that can't possibly work. But you run IP tables and it works fine. What was going on? And then I realized that actually I didn't realize it. Someone else realized, because I'm like the last person. Sometimes I have a hard time debugging the broken arm. I'm so down in kind of the scanning electron microscope level that I have a hard time seeing the broken arm. And someone else noticed, like, the capitalization of IP tables is really screwy. And they started Googling around, and sure enough, what had happened was there had been an LX zone that had been created with no root password, and someone had rooted the zone and then installed their own IP tables that was now core dumping, because it actually isn't. It's actually on SmartOS, and so the malware basically wasn't working, which was kind of funny. But I think it does show that you can do actually a lot when you can observe an attacker, and it'd be really cool to build an intrusion detection system where because you wonder if you kind of could throw one of these things out on the internet in a controlled way, if you couldn't find some of these things that are being used in the wild before people realize it. Maybe you could even find people that are exploring new 0 days before they're actually in use. I mean, that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, that'd definitely be cool. Okay, well, I think that was the last question we had. So is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap it up?
Yeah, no, I feel like I'm all ran. I feel like, see, this is I came in almost pre-exhausted from having to wrangle with Skype. So
Yeah.
I never know if I'm like turning into like the Andy Rooney of operating systems, or am I like, I don't know if I'm. So hopefully I'm not too cynical and embittered.
No, this was perfect. Well, we appreciate you giving us an hour and 10, 15 minutes.
Hour
However
and
long
20
it ended up
minutes
being.
every
That
time.
was perfect.
Always happy to do it. Great to talk to you guys as always. And yeah, always a fun conversation. And thanks again for all of the great technical the collaboration between.
Oh, I got to ask, are you going to make it to MeetBSD in November?
That is in
Berkeley.
Where is that? That's
It's at Berkeley.
Oh yeah, definitely Berkeley. Yes, I am to the point where I really need to travel less at this point.
Okay.
But Bay Area, absolutely. Yeah, it'd be fun.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun, and it's going back to the birthplace of BSD. So it's like that doesn't happen very often.
Awesome. I feel like that would be great. We should do some. I went to some Oktoberfest last week and gave a fun talk on oral tradition and the role that oral tradition plays in software engineering. But it would be great to have some talks. I don't know if people are going to have some talks on kind of some of the early days of BSD would be really fascinating.
Last year's or 2 years ago, MeetBSD was Kirk McKusick talking about the original TCP/IP stories and how that came into BSD and
nice.
so on. And it's always one of my favorite things.
That'd be great. Yeah, was that video? I have to go check
that
that
one
out.
is on YouTube.
All right, I'll check that out. With at this last one, I did I did an out loud reading for the first time ever in my presentation. I did an out loud reading of, if you've ever read "The Bug Count Also Rises," which is a Hemingway spoof about debugging like proprietary software in the '90s. But it is so beautiful. So I'll leave you with that. "The Bug Count Also Rises." You have to go check that out.
Nice. Well, again, thanks so much for being with us today, Brian. We appreciate it. Until the next time, though. We'll definitely let you know. We can get you back on here again.
Cool. Absolutely.
Okay, hope you guys enjoyed that interview. Always a treat to have Brian with us. So, of course, thank you, Brian, for taking the time. But we got a news roundup to get to. So before we hop into that, let's just mention our next sponsor this week, which is going to be IXsystems. Of course, the website for that, IXsystems.com/BSD Now, where you can go and get in touch with those sales folks, those sales engineers, actually, who you can actually have a real conversation. So you're an IT guy or a sysadmin or a purchaser at a business. Like, you can call up IX and actually have a real conversation about what you're going to be doing with the box, not just that I want this box. No. Well, I need to run a mail server. I need to run a database server. I have lots of things to store, lots of big files.
In my case, it was I want to do video transcoding. So here's the video card I want to use. How can we possibly fit this in a 1U case? It's like we tried to do it in some of our existing machines, but the SATA cables poke up into the fan of the, and they did some research and came back and found Supermicro makes a motherboard where the cards are they have a riser card, but it's on the very edge of the motherboard rather than in the middle of the motherboard like your primary PCIe slots are, and so no part of the motherboard goes under the video card. So the video card's just right down to the raw case. So it gives it that little bit of extra room and makes it fit. In fact, that one could probably actually fit a double thickness video card, although then the fan would be like right up against the bottom of the case and might not have enough air.
Yeah.
But the card I want is single slot anyway. It just, I need the SATA cables not to be poking it in the fan. But they did a little bit of research and managed to find something for me and then get me back a quote and with a couple of options. It's like, do you want 10 gigabit copper or 10 gigabit fiber NICs? Because they're different and so on. But yes, it was very easy to work with them. And they actually understood what I was talking about. If I had asked Dell, they're like, well, we don't certify anything with video cards except for these really expensive machines over here. It's like, well, that's not really helpful.
That's right. You actually get to pick and choose what you want. And like I said, call up those guys today. Have a real conversation with them. Let them figure out how they can help you. And, of course, they're backed by the latest and greatest Intel processors. Yes. They can get you whatever you need.
Yeah,
so, again, be very specific.
E5 in a little 1U.
That's right. Right. So let them see what they can make for you and, let them be a part of your next success story. Okay, so news roundup. So, of course, this is an interesting one. So, after 22 years, 386BSD gets an update. And, of course, this is brought to us this week by Slashdot. But, wow, an update to 386BSD. So, here's the quote. I'll just read it. It was actually a little short blurb here, but it says, 386BSD was last released in 1994 with a series of articles in Dr. Dobbs' journal. But then developers for this BSD operating system started migrating both to FreeBSD and NetBSD. An anonymous Slashdot user writes that the last known public release was version 0.1 until Wednesday when Lynn Jolitz, one of the co-authors of 386BSD, released the source code to version 1.0 as well as 2.0 up on GitHub. So, of course, 386BSD takes us back to the days where you could count every file in your Unix distribution and, more importantly, read and understand all of your OS source code. 386BSD is also the missing link between BSD and Linux. One can find fragments of Linus Torvalds' math emulation code in the source code of 386BSD. To quote Linus, if 386BSD had been available when I started on Linux, Linux probably would have never happened. So, of course, though it was designed for the Intel 386 microprocessors, there's already instructions for launching it on the hosted hardware virtualization service such as QEMU. So if you actually want to try and run it, you can. So there you go. You have it. You can now grab the new hotness that is 386BSD and run it 2016 style. Or maybe you'd rather go grab 11 and actually get some work done. But either way, it's neat. It's neat that that's a thing now.
Well, in particular, 386BSD was there, and then there was people making patches against it, and some, disagreements about how those patches should be managed, and that's actually what led to there being FreeBSD and NetBSD. If things had gone a little different, 386BSD might be the only BSD, and we might not have had Linux either, and we would have just have this one giant open source project that everybody worked on. I'm sure they would have had a fork at some point, but
because they couldn't have called it 386BSD for too much longer.
That changed the name at some point, I suppose.
Right, the name needed to change.
But yeah,
but
it's
cool.
definitely interesting seeing some of the history of it, and also some of the features they promised that eventually we got to see that are how different it is from what FreeBSD and NetBSD actually started with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, cool. Well, hey, so an update on a story from last week. We mentioned the very, very limited edition of OpenBSD 6.0. The signed CD sets had gone for auction on eBay. Of course, the proceeds are going to support the foundation. So a quick update on that today as of where we stand. First set, of course, sold in 5 days for $4,200. The second set sold for $3,000. Third set sold for $817. And the fourth is actually currently up for bidding. It looks like there's another 2 days on that. So if you're watching this live, of course. But there you have it. The fourth set is almost wrapped up for bidding, and the fifth and last set is going to go pretty quickly after that.
So while the price has been trending down, I'm guessing the very last one's going to go back up.
Yes.
So your best bet is to get in on this one right now.
The fourth one's probably the one you want, right? So I would definitely go ahead and take a look at that and see if you can grab a piece of BSD history before it's gone forever. Mm-hmm. And then who knows, maybe one of these will show up again down the road on eBay and it'll go for like $10,000 or something, right? But still, that's cool.
All the autographs. It's a lot of autographs.
That's right. Okay, so Alan, tell us about this next one. There's a new prototype that looks like some application container stuff.
Yeah,
what's going on there?
There's been this push to standardize things like Docker around this specification called the Application Container Specification. And it's basically a standard on how you should make these without being very specific about the actual implementation, just what the features and the interfaces should be. So this is kind of, the Rocket is the reference implementation. So it's called Rocket. This one is called Jetpack. And I've seen a little bit of talk about this at BSDCan last year, I think.
Yeah, it's come up a couple times in different places.
But this is an implementation of this application container specification specifically for FreeBSD using jails as the isolation mechanism and ZFS for the layered storage. And it kind of goes to show the power of having a specification like this that isn't specific to the implementation, meaning that you can substitute the various Linux components for other operating systems like Illumos zones or FreeBSD jails and so on, and use ZFS instead of, say, OverlayFS or whatever, and make something that, a container made to the specification will run on any one of these operating systems nicely without having to be all Docker specific or whatever.
That would be nice.
So yeah, they say Jetpack is an experimental and incomplete implementation of the application container specification, specifically for FreeBSD. it's a prototype. It's incomplete. The docs aren't all done yet. They say this. The documentation they do have is mostly uses the language from Rocket about the specific words and implementation and so on, because that's the reference implementation of the application container specification. While the documentation will be expanded in the future, currently you need to at least be familiar with Rocket's documentation to actually understand the Jetpack documentation.
Sure.
But it's definitely interesting, and it'll be. It looks like it has very few dependencies. Basically, just compiled for Go 1.4, and will run on anything FreeBSD 10.1 and newer.
Okay. Yeah, that's something. It's one of those things. If it eventually matures and becomes better supported, I think we could have some really big wins having some kind of these tools on FreeBSD. It would be cool. I kind of felt like we've already had like the solid framework with jails under the hood. We just need better tooling, a la Docker, to make things like jails just more accessible to the growing public. But wish them all the luck with that. We hope this becomes one of the cool new implementations going forward. Okay, so next up, do you remember the good old days? When Microsoft was the driving force behind UNIX? Well, wait. What? Did you just say what? Yeah, actually, it's true. Let's sit back and let Fossbeiss tell us a tale once was reality. So, of course, our story begins somewhat in the late 70s. And I'll just read from the article here. It says, turning back the pages to the late 1970s, Microsoft entered into an agreement with AT&T Corporation to license UNIX from AT&T. While the company didn't sell the OS to public, it licensed it to other OEM vendors like Intel, of course, SCO, and Tandy. As Microsoft had faced legal troubles due to the Unix name, the company renamed it and came up with their own Unix distribution. So AT&T licensed Unix to Redmond that was passed on to other OEMs as Xenix. Do you guys remember that now? Does that ring a bell? I remember being vaguely aware of that at the time when I was doing SCO work, like seeing that somewhere, but even this is before my time a bit. But it's interesting, of course, to recall a time when Microsoft enabled people to run Unix, an operating system originally designed for large and multi-user systems, on a microcomputer. Even though it came first, Unix was probably more powerful than MS-DOS. So whatever happened to this Microsoft-flavored Unix, you may ask? Well, sadly, it was ditched for DOS for, of course, reasons. In the early 1980s, IBM was looking for an OS to power its PC. As IBM did not want to maintain any ties with the recently split AT&T, Xenix was automatically rejected. To fulfill the tech giant's demand, Microsoft bought 86DOS from Seattle Computer Products and managed to convince IBM to use it in their systems. Slowly, Microsoft started losing interest in Xenix and traded the full rights with SCO, who was, of course, a Xenix partner company. Then the company filed bankruptcy in 2007 before taking the Xenix legacy to the 21st century in the form of OpenServer, which, of course, was previously known as SCO Unix and SCO Open Desktop. Man, so those parts I was there for
then the newest version of SCO OpenServer is based on FreeBSD.
That's right. So Xinuous is doing that, which is really cool. They got a neat business model. We should have them on the show again at some point to talk a little bit more about what they're doing.
Interview we did at BSDCan last year came up in the reruns last week.
Was it BSDCan or VBSD Con? That was VBSD.
The one we did with David was at BSDCan.
BSDCan?
I also did one with I can't remember the French guy's name now at Cambridge.
Oh, okay. But of course, this is an interesting chapter in Unix history, to be sure. And funny enough, they may come full circle someday with Microsoft showing more and more interest in Unix and BSD once again. Go figure.
As we announced a couple of months ago, Microsoft now sells commercial support for running FreeBSD on their Hyper-V thing.
It's a strange world we live in. So are they admitting finally, like, hey, that whole DOS thing, sorry about that.
Yeah, we just did that for IBM.
Right? Anyway, of course, interesting stuff, and it helped fill in some of the gaps in my knowledge of history here.
Okay, so we got some beastie bits to get to, but of course the last sponsor this week we're going to mention first is Tarsnap. Website for that is tarsnap.com/BSD Now, where you want to go there right now and get signed up. Make sure you start doing your backups the proper way, the Tarsnap way, the encrypted way. Don't trust your bits to the cloud. I mean, I don't. You shouldn't either. And Tarsnap's one of the only ways I can guarantee that my bits aren't being, snooped on, looked at, or whatever.
And that you can,
because only I have the key.
It's the only way you can assure that you can destroy the copy that's in the cloud. You destroy the key, and there's no way to decrypt it.
That's right. That's right. So definitely you should get signed up with TarSnap today. They have clients for just about everything under the sun. So yes, you can technically you could use it, I suppose, as an encrypted multi-platform solution, kind of moving things back and forth. But clients for Linux, Windows, of course, all the different BSDs. So check your favorite packaging system. You should be able to find a package for it. But for the truly paranoid among us, how about this one? You can actually grab the source code for TarSnap, audit it, verify it does exactly what it's supposed to do, compile it yourself. So you don't even have to trust a binary from your particular distribution or BSD of choice. So definitely a good thing. How many other backup solutions offer that? I can't think of any off the top of my head. So there you go. Definitely check it out today and get signed up, and you'll be shocked how cheap it is too. So put a few bucks in there, at least give it a whirl, see what you think.
And then we got a bunch of conference roundups. Not quite all in order, but anyway. First one here is Michael Lucas went to Ohio Linux Fest and has some thoughts on it. He says spent the last weekend at Ohio Linux Fest where he presented about ZFS and met many of his readers and so on. And he says the obvious question was, how do things go between a BSD Unix guy and a bunch of Linux fans? So he talked about that a bit, but he also managed to find Bizarro World versions of Andrew Fresh and Peter Hessler from OpenBSD. He's got a picture here of what are very striking resemblances to those two.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so next up we have learn X in Y minutes, where in this case X is ZFS. So we have a link to that. If you'd like to get a little background on ZFS, take a look at that.
They have a bunch of information here, and at the bottom they have links to other resources where they actually include our tutorial on ZFS and a few other interesting things like the FreeBSD handbook and so on.
Cool. Okay, next up we have a commit here. It looks like adding touchscreen support for the official 7-inch Raspberry Pi Touch display. So it looks like that's been added, and all the hardware communications performed through the video core module. And let's see, EVDEV is used as a user-land interface, supports up to 10 touch points, but it says for now the driver emulates a single touch device because he doesn't have the GUI bits necessary to test all the functionality. So it's not enabled by default in the Raspberry Pi 1 and 2 configs, so you still need to go turn it on if you want to try it out. But the code is there.
If you're building something on top of Raspberry Pi and want to use the official touchscreen, having a driver available for that is a big step forward.
Definitely helps.
And more from the same developer. Pi?
Yeah. Oh, you got it.
He's got here a 64-bit port of U-Boot for the Raspberry Pi 3, so we can finally start booting 64-bit on the Raspberry Pi 3. So this eliminates one of the remaining to-do items to eventually have FreeBSD running 64-bit on the Raspberry Pi 3.
Fantastic.
And apparently outputs to both the serial and HDMI console.
That is very, very cool. Well, excellent. Hopefully the Raspberry Pi 3 becomes a really cool supported platform here soon. Next up, we have SNIA, the SDC 2016 recap. Michael Dexter gives us an overview of that, which is actually hosted over at IXsystems blog. So I want to check that out. And speaking of IXsystems blog, we also have a wrap-up on OpenZFS, Stronger Than Ever, another blog post talking about that conference. So definitely check those out.
There's some talk about Swordfish API, which is a Redfish-compatible RESTful API for controlling storage appliances.
That's right. That's right. So we're investigating that. That looks neat. Okay, next up, accurate, traceable, and verifiable time synchronization for world financial markets. And we have a link to a PDF here, it looks like, posted over at nist.gov.
Yes. This one's of interest because one of the authors is George Neville Neal of the FreeBSD project. But yeah, it's about using BSD to have accurate, verifiable time synchronization for stock markets. So if you're a time geek, you should definitely check this one out.
So this one's an oldie but a goodie, I guess. April 1st, 1980. Yes. Oh, Holy Wars and a Plea for Peace. Yes. It looks like, what's it about, Big Indian and Little Indian or something?
They have the Big Indians and the Little Indians, and they are at war with each other. And it's talking about, the arguments about which bit should get to go first across the wire.
Okay. Definitely interesting. Hadn't seen that before.
I think a little bit of this is an April Fool's joke, but... It's
still
a very interesting, well written out IETF article that's 17 pages.
Okay, well, time to get over to the feedback and questions here. So first up, we have Morgan, who writes in about zero filling a VM. So it says, well, actually, I'll read it and let you answer it, Alan. It says, a note for Alan. Now that DigitalOcean is about to begin charging for snapshot storage, I'm wondering about reducing the size of them and the storage fees. More a curiosity than concern about cost. Some of my snapshots, while compressed, are larger than the actual data they contain due to free space containing unreferenced data. I'm wondering about creating a file from dev0 to occupy all the remaining storage space and then deleting it, leaving the space zeroed. This will grow the VM to capacity, so all the droplet operations will take the longest, I assume, but RLE compression should result in a smaller snapshot. Are there any operational downsides to doing this in a ZFS-based system? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, in particular, I'd be slightly concerned whether DigitalOcean actually does the RLE on it, because otherwise you'll be just making all your images bigger and end up paying more.
Sure.
You basically always pay the maximum price. And I don't know if they support some kind of like unmapped trim type thing to actually mark stuff, unused space as deleted. In general, the images are relatively small and it's, not worth the effort for that, but it might be interesting.
Okay.
In general, in ZFS, there's no real harm in that. Newer versions of ZFS are going to have an eager zero feature where when you first spin up the VM, it can zero out all the space in the background. That one's to solve a slightly different issue, though, whereas a lot of things like if you're using Amazon and you get a big EBS volume, they don't actually allocate the space until the first time you use each block. And so the very first time you write to a block, it takes a lot longer than the second time you write to the block. So what they do is go through and zero out every block in the beginning. Now, if you did it all of them before you start ZFS, then the machine you spin up a new VM and you have to wait an hour for it to write out all this stuff before it works.
Sure.
And then also depending on how many IOPS you have and some other stuff. So with eager zero, it basically does it in the background so that you eventually get to full speed, but you can start working right away. So something like that might also be interesting if you don't end up get charged for storing zeros. But if you do, then you obviously don't want to do that.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
So
okay.
that might be a question.
Maybe somebody will find that out and let us know.
You might want to ask DigitalOcean support about that, the best way to shrink your snapshots.
Okay, so next up is Charlie asking about ZFS bitrot. You want to read this one out?
Thanks so much for the show. I've been a listener since episode 1, and he loves having such a great resource for sharpening his BSD know-how. Following in the footsteps of Judah Broadcasting's Chris Fisher, my wife and I are living full-time in an RV, although we're thoroughly enjoying it for anybody who's curious. Interesting. He says, with our new living arrangement, I am slightly more concerned about physical security than I previously was. I would not take much to break into an RV and make off with their valuables. Therefore, I'd like to encrypt all my critical data. Currently, I have a small file server running ZFS with no disk encryptions. Disks are arranged in a RAID 10 style, so data striped over the mirrored pairs. My question is, if I use Geli encrypted disks as the foundation of my new pool, what happens if a flip bit or other corruption condition occurs? Is ZFS on top of Geli just as safe from data corruption standpoint as ZFS on a raw disk, even though ZFS cannot reach down into the Geli layer? So yes, if Geli returns an error up to ZFS, ZFS will recover it from the other side of the mirror and it'll be fine. Because of encryption, you might lose a slightly larger block, but ZFS is already using pretty big blocks anyway, so it's probably not going to be a very big deal at all. So yes, ZFS on top of Geli is just as safe against bit rot. And
cool.
Yeah, he says, thanks for shedding light on this. I hear about encrypted ZFS pools quite frequently, and I'm assuming it's relatively safe, but I wanted to make sure. Yeah. In fact, you could probably get away with doing it without having to create a new pool even. Because you have the mirrors, you could offline one disk, set up Geli and replace the disk with the Geli encrypted version, and it would resilver all the data, and just do that one at a time through your 4 disks. And then you would have all of your disks encrypted without having to make a new pool. But if you can just make a new one, it's much faster and easier and safer.
Sure. It's just you can do that manually while the system's actually running, even, which is kind of cool.
The downside is that while one of the disks is resilvering, you're obviously, if the other disk dies, your data is hosed.
You're kind of in trouble.
So it's always better to do it, but you can do some hopscotch and do it in place if you really want to.
I did something similar where I was going, I think, was it a 4K or no? I was doing something, but I ended up throwing a third disk in, letting that silver before I broke the,
replace, well, the other disk is still online is very nice because then you have your parity disk and your original disk and then the new disk and all of them are online at the same time until the new one's all caught up and switched in.
Mm-hmm. So, okay. Next up, we have Matthias who writes in asking about TrueOS. He says, "Hey guys, congratulations and many thanks for your work and treasured weekly show. All my laptops for at least 5 years and server boxes for the last 15 have been running FreeBSD on it. But as I gave up on freelancing, got a company job 2 years ago, I gave Ubuntu a shot on my company laptop to get some experience and for maximum compatibility with my workmates. I'm starting at another company next month and had enough of Ubuntu. I'm looking at installing TrueOS on my company laptop. Can you recommend any array of modern laptops that suspend and are Wi-Fi supported in TrueOS? I do not mind getting my hands a bit dirty." The second question is, "I'd also like to know whether TrueOS is still using LaunchD, as the LaunchD wiki seems to imply. He said, based on my ignorance, prejudice, and gut feeling, I sincerely hope not, but I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about it." So answer your second question first. No, we're not based on LaunchD. We never actually were either.
I think that was the TrueNAS thing. Does it use LaunchD?
The next BSD project they were doing, that they were doing some work, but PCBSD and TrueOS never moved over to that or anything. So I think I experimented with it for all of a day or something just to see what it would do and decided, wasn't ready. But anyway, no, we're not using that. So no worries there. As far as laptops go, Wi-Fi supported. So most of the new TrueOSs, we have the IWM driver. So I'm using like a Lenovo Carbon X1 Generation 3. Works great, but the suspend, no. So I can't suspend it. I can suspend. I just can't resume on it.
Yeah,
so that part's not working. The older T520s definitely suspended and resumed just fine. Mm-hmm.
And those have the slightly older IWN NIC, which has a slightly more stable driver.
True. So that would be kind of the era I would look for if you want the suspend. And if you don't care about the suspend so much and you can live with the Carbon, I mean, the battery life on it's really good.
And it's so light.
I love it. It's so light, yes. And I get way better life than I did on my 520. So good deal.
A lot of people have luck with Dells as well, but Lenovo is definitely the best bet for hardware support.
Yep, that's the way to go. Okay, so next up is Dale. You want to read this one here?
So he says, "I've been listening to your show regularly. It's how I stay current on a broad variety of technologies without needing to intimately follow each individual one, so thank you for that." He says, "I wanted to relay my recent experience with the minimal DigitalOcean droplet, the $5 one with one CPU and 512 megs of RAM." And he links to a blog post he did about it. He says, "Was I expecting too much from a minimal droplet? Does it look like there might be a problem with the droplet infrastructure? I wanted to offload basic management to DigitalOcean, but not if it means that I rebuild my server, migrate everything." And so I guess I'm jumping ahead here. What's his actual problem he was having?
He was asking about some issues related to router and NAT cables that might sound familiar.
Okay. So his new server is behind a Hitron internet over cable adapter. The internal NAT/router gets one IP address and it serves his local LAN, both wired and Wi-Fi, and is passing a second IP address through the Hitron to the FreeBSD server. It seemed initially that at least often as every 12 hours, I was unable to connect SSH or HTTP from my laptop on the LAN to the FreeBSD server. I rebooted a bunch of stuff which restored operation, but I'm not sure what fixed things. I had been running IPFW in basic workstation mode, allowing SSH and HTTP only, but have switched to the open for the time being. Also, the system is stable now, but it seems to have a periodic weirdness. Just now, Safari on the iPad on the local... What?
At the local coffee shop reported the server stopped responding.
But then Chrome loaded fine. For what it's worth, I also added NoIP's dynamic DNS client and wondered if benefiting from a side effect of updating, and now that's happening. If it does update, even though the IP address hasn't changed. He was just curious if you heard any issues related to NAT router cable adapters. No.
Not really.
Yeah. It's very hard to tell what might be happening from the detail you're given there, but it probably doesn't sound like a FreeBSD problem. It sounds like the Hitron internet over cable adapter might be stopping passing packets or something. And, obviously the problem with rebooting a bunch of devices and everything works again is you don't know which reboot actually affected.
Yeah, you need to do it one at a time next time.
Of course, see, when your internet's not working or whatever, you're kind of in a hurry, right?
True. Okay, so the next one is James, also has a DigitalOcean question. He says, I'll start with the obligatory congrats on the show. I've not missed an episode yet, so keep up the good work. He said, I've recently migrated from a UFS FreeBSD 10.1 droplet over to a new ZFS-backed FreeBSD 10.3 for the obvious benefits. I migrated my 6 jails from EasyJail over to IOCage with very little issue. Having now run the ZFS droplet for a month or so, I will occasionally find that the droplet becomes unresponsive. Jails running Nginx no longer respond to HTTPS, unable to SSH into the host and access via the HTML5 console.
So even the console
My only option is... What was that?
He says access via the HTML5 console is frozen, so the whole machine is frozen.
Yeah. Sounds like the whole machine died. He said, my only option is power down and restart the droplet. Having moved to ZFS, I thought it was about time to up the memory from 512 to 1 gigabyte. As Alan likes to remind us, there's very little RAM for ZFS Plus processes such as Nginx and I dare say MariaDB as well. That being said, having looked at the resource usage around the time, everything seems normal. DO already sets the tuning for the ARC max to 128 megs and the cache size to 5 megs, which was my first port of call. So the question is, where would you start diagnosing the underlying cause? What is the logical course of action to get to the bottom and fix whatever's causing my droplet to fall over? Thanks again,
hard
James.
To say with there being no output like that.
I would turn on kernel dumps and just
it seems like it's hanging
see if it's panicking.
Because there's a sysctl for ZFS called the deadman switch or something like that, where ZFS will purposely panic the system if it takes too long for certain operations to complete. Which I think by default is like if it tries to do something and it doesn't happen within 10 seconds, it panics the system instead of letting it hang forever. And that might give you an idea of where the problem is happening.
Sure.
Outside of that, I don't know.
Kind of be the first place to start without any other details.
Yeah,
we don't even
but I
know
would
what
say
to look at.
Maybe logging something like top in batch mode. Just log it to the disk every 60 seconds or every 20 seconds or something, so that after it hangs, you can go back and see if there was a trend. Was the system running out of memory and then hung, or was it some other thing? Ideally, you might want to try moving up to one of the 2 gigabyte droplets. The other nice thing with DigitalOcean is if you don't choose to resize the internal disk, you can always shrink it back.
Sure.
So you can try 2 gigabytes for a little while, and if it doesn't work, you can go back. If it doesn't make a difference, you can go back to 1 gigabyte and not have to always pay more. And because you get billed hourly, no matter what, you will only pay. If you upgrade to 2 gigabytes for half the month, you only pay the extra or half of the extra price. Because even 1 gig is relatively low for ZFS. Although the system shouldn't just hang.
Especially. It says he's got 6 jails running it too with the database and other
stuff. The database could be taking up a lot. But no matter what, it really shouldn't just hang like that. Yeah. I would look at
well, if you find out more details, let us know.
The ZFS deadman switch and maybe just logging top, I think it's -B for batch mode, and just log that to a file on a fairly regular basis and try to see if there's a trend of what's happening around the time when it hangs.
Yep. Okay. Well, cool. Well, thanks for writing in, James. We appreciate it. So it's time to wrap up the show, folks. It's been another exciting week. And, of course, we thank Brian for being on the show with us this week. And, of course, we want to remind you to send all your questions, comments. If you have any show ideas or topics or stories maybe you see floating around the internet, send those in to feedback@bsdnow.tv. Don't be alarmed if we don't respond right away. A lot of times we just hold on to those and throw them into a future episode. This is our response to you. So definitely keep that coming, though. We appreciate it. You guys find a lot of really cool stuff floating around the internet, commits and whatnot that Alan and me and JT just don't have time to sit and read through every single thing. So keep that coming in, and we'll make sure it ends up on a future episode. So, of course, thank you for being here. As we close, don't forget, MeetBSD is coming up. Get your registration done. So if you want to come see us at Berkeley, that's going to be a lot of fun, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.